Today, on a special What's That About, we are excited to talk to Burhan Azeem, Cambridge City Councilor since 2022. When we first spoke in January 2026, he had just been elected as Vice Mayor for the current session. Shortly thereafter, Councilor Azeem announced he was throwing his hat in the ring for the second Middlesex Senate seat, currently occupied by retiring Pat Jehlen. On this week's episode, we plan to discuss the councilor's reasons for running for Senate, some of the big issues he's running on, and how he hopes to affect change in a famously ineffective and opaque state house, as we've covered here extensively. Thanks for coming on the show, Vice Mayor Azeem.
Happy to be here. Always glad to chat with you, Pete. It's only been a few weeks since our last debate, so excited to chat again.
Yeah. Yeah, we won't cover all the same ground. I will refer people to that. That tape is now up of the debate we had. But when we last spoke on Zoom, you had just been reelected, as I said, and selected by your fellow councilors to be vice mayor. Can you talk about what made you decide to run for the Senate, and when did you decide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that part of my goal since being elected to city council has been a lot of work on housing and pre-K and transit stuff. And I've been thinking about it for a little while since I got elected for the first time. I wrote an op-ed then in the Crimson Chronicle, which was still around right before I got elected, which was like, hey, if I got elected, the things I would love to do is expand the affordable housing overlay, rezone our corridors, get rid of parking minimums, and exclusionary zoning. And I'm pretty proud to say, like, we've knocked that whole list done. And at the same time, another thing I cared about was a cycling safety ordinance, which is almost to completion too. And I'm hopeful that by the end of this term, it will be done. And so it just feels like a lot of the work that I was elected to do and I really cared about, we're now entering the end of an era in terms of like housing and transit policy and, having universal pre-K. And we just talked about expansion as well. And so I think that was a big part of it. And then you never know how these things play out. Pat Jehlen announced her retirement after 20 years in the state Senate. And there's only 40 state senators. And so with 21 in a room, you can change the direction of the whole state. And I think that it's a very important role and a rare opportunity. And so as I was reflecting, I was like, actually, I feel like a lot of the work that I want to do on city council will be done by the time I would be elected if I won. And I would love to, have an opportunity to bring some of that great energy to the state house as well.
Okay, well, let's stay there for a second on your work for the city council. Do you have any concerns about leaving before your term is up? Perhaps, I know you said a lot of the big things you think are done, but leaving unfinished business with your voters on the table, and was the fact that I believe Dana Bullister will be in line to replace you. Was that a factor? Did you consider that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a factor. I think that Dana is great, fantastic. I think that she will, carry on in a strong way in ways that I believe would be good for the city. And I think that in some ways it'll actually be a nice transition in that I feel like I'll feel a lot more confident rather than leaving an open seat to have Dana Bullister fill in and her to have a little bit of time to get her grounding before the next election comes up. So I think that I'd be really excited. I think that you will always leave the work in progress because the work is never done. But I really do think that we are, towards the end of an era. Like I think that there's always some fine tuning and stuff, but I don't think that beyond the little lingering work in Central Square that we're hopefully going to pick up again in the fall, there's not that much more rezoning to be done. I think that the cycling safety ordinance will be over hopefully by the end of this term, and so we're gonna have to find some new things to fight about, I think, in the city.
Yeah. Oh, I can think of a few things. It seems like, in light of the amendments that Tim Flaherty and Kathy Zusy just brought up and the petition from Doug Brown to trying to hamstring the AHO, do you have any concerns about backsliding in Cambridge?
Yeah, so I think that there was a Doug Brown petition that would have limited both the multifamily housing ordinance and the affordable housing overlay. And I'm proud that we just voted that out of committee today with a negative recommendation. So I think that will end that part of the conversation. For the multifamily housing ordinance, I understand the conversation, right? It was a big change and people are adjusting and adapting to it and they have suggestions. And I think we'll look at all of them. And I think that come to a good place. I'm fairly confident. I'm not really worried about the grander going backwards. I think housing is popular. I think we see that in every election. I think it's in the national conversation. I think people fundamentally understand. I think that if you can, do stuff around the edges that make people more comfortable with the development in a way that is also helpful for the long-term political sustainability, I'm always open to that conversation.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about your run for the Senate then. You've been representing the city of Cambridge for the last 4.5 years. What's different in your mind about representing a district that spans from Medford and Winchester to Somerville and Cambridge, of course? How does that affect your campaigning and what you choose to focus on in your platform?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's a little bit of both to it, which is one, I think, I'm a fundamental believer. And I think that I'm like one of the most boring politicians if you listen to me because I say the same stuff over and over again. But it's like, I really do believe that like housing and transportation, utility costs, and childcare are like the four biggest budget line items. And if you take care of those, that helps people not just in the district, but across the state and really across the country. It is really those four things that eat up more of our paycheck than anything else. And so I'm a big believer that that is universal. And you do see a lot of differences through the city, right? Like Cambridge and Somerville, I think have a very similar population, but Cambridge is in a more steady financial ground because we have Kendall Square and because we've had a lot of housing growth, which adds to our tax base as well. I think Somerville has a little bit more, a little bit less financial wiggle room. Medford is undergoing a lot of difficulties in that it's like a community that is not as wealthy as Cambridge or Somerville is, has a much more working class community, is trying to fund a new high school that might cost $800 million and pass an override, but is unsure if they'll be able to afford that next budget item. And then Winchester, I think, is much more of like your traditional, like, wealthier suburb, but also one that's really struggling with laying off teachers right now and had a failed override that's been really, really difficult. And so I think that it's like four different communities that I think really span the range of communities you have in Massachusetts that are pretty different material conditions and things that they're struggling with.
Okay, let's get a little in the like political horse race here. Like, what do you bring to the table for people the second Middlesex that the other challengers, with some of them have pretty big names locally, like Reps Christine Barber, Councilor Mike McLaughlin, and Representative Erika Uyterhoeven don't. What are you bringing to the table that they don't have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of local heroes in this race, right? And I think fundamentally all are good people. I think that, there's like three different parts of politics, and mostly we get just stuck on the first one, which is like, what are your values, right? If you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're like a moderate or a progressive. And I think that therein lies a lot of value differences, right? But I don't actually think that that's where policy stops. The second part is like, hey, like, what do you think is your focus? Because you can only move the needle on so many things at once, right? And how do you do that? And then third is like, actually, how good are your solutions, right? Like, there's a lot of different answers. And even if you land on the same answer, like the specific language, the specific details you come up with profoundly matter. And I think that those last two places are a place where we have a lot of distinction and differences between the candidates.
Mm-hmm. What is your focus going to be? What do you think your focus is going to be that's different?
Yeah, so let's go down with the issues, right? So I'll talk about transit as one of my big four, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that like, some of the candidates will say like, hey, like I'm really proud that the Green Line extension happened in the first place, right? Like it was a really tough fight. We had to like sue the government. We had to like barely got it across the finish line, but I'm very proud to have been part of the fight that got it to the finish line. And what I am is when something's in motion in the State House, I can talk with my colleagues and make sure that like things don't get dropped. And I think it's very valuable. Actually, it is like profoundly true that we almost lost the Green Line extension, and it is really, really it took a lot of work from a lot of people to make sure that it happened, right? I think there's a second view that like, what we need is we need to dramatically increase funding for the T, right? And like, dramatically increase taxes and make sure we have as much money going into it as possible. And I also agree with that. Like the T has a huge budget shortfall, and that's something that I talk a lot about as well. And that is also true, right? And my place is like, I think both of those are accurate. I also support more funding for the T. And then what I think is my particular value add is that none of that is enough, right? Like we will never get to a better place with the T where we are now. Like we could dramatically increase the funding, but the Green Line expansion was one of the most expensive light rail projects in world history.
Hmm.
And it took 32 years. And then we had to shut it down because we put the tracks on wrong. And we knew about that for years before. So it's both a funding problem, but it's also a management problem. It's a procurement problem. And there's all these details that really, really matter. And one thing that has come up recently in terms of like transit research is like you could actually probably cut the cost of purchasing a bus by a third to two thirds, right? So from 33 to 66%, depending on the details, just by how you do procurement and processing. And that is not the hot topic, but like that is a huge difference. You could put the same amount of money by, tremendously double or triple the amount of buses. And like that would be a huge, huge, huge impact, right? And so it's not just about like all of us agree that the T needs to do better and you need more funding, but it's like, well, how do you exactly do that? And I think like that is one example of an area where I really, really care about the results. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like the T always has this funding problem, and I mean, at least in my mind, a lot of it is because the budget relies on out of town legislators who don't see the political need to properly fund the T. Yeah, do you have a feeling about that or about attacking that issue? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big like the structure determines the policy incentives and the results type of person, which is a very nerdy way of looking at politics, but I think really is quite compelling. Which is to say that like it's really important to feel like I have like a really like heavy anger about the T, and I think it doesn't come from a place of like just like frustration at the staff or funding, but it's like we used to be very different. We're the ideal city for a transit system that's based on like trains, right? Which is like we don't have a grid. You're never going to be able to run buses the way that we can in other cities because we just don't have enough space for bus lanes on every road. And getting from point A to point B sometimes only has one path versus if you're on a grid, right? Cars are really, really difficult at our density, and you go down the list, right? Trains are a really great solution for our style of city. And we knew that, which is why we were the first subway system in America. That's why up until the 1980s, we were adding like 20 stations a year between the MBTA and the commuter rail. We actually have a very expansive MBTA and commuter rail system, even today, compared to most of our peer cities. What happened is that in the last like 45 years, we kind of lost our way. And what's, sad about that is like 45 years is for almost everyone, the majority of their lives or the entirety of them. But in terms of policy space, that's actually a very recent phenomenon, right? Like for most of history, we didn't used to be this way. And so you go into the weeds and it's like, a bunch of things from the fact that like, transit just became less popular, especially in the 80s and 70s, and we fell in love with suburbia. So the Red Line expansion to Arlington was just like less popular, and there was less political weight into it. I think part of it is like we fell in love with like this sense of like government is bad, and then you should hire consultants to do stuff because they're private sector and they're just smarter, and we just lost a lot of government capacity. And then it was the fact that we changed the funding formula to the T, which is what you were getting at, and that like we changed it from just like funding it through the regular budget to instead saying that 1 cent of the 6.25 sales tax that you pay every time you buy something goes to the T. But what that meant is that a lot of it, the funding comes from, people in central and western Mass who feel like they're paying into something that they're not getting the benefit of. And it's created this really bad incentive structure where the T is no longer, the primary goal is no longer to just get you from point A to B as efficiently and effective as possible. Instead, it's become a jobs program and a transit and a climate program and like a anti-poverty program in ways that are good. Like those are really important programs, but like the MBTA is struggling just to do its basic functions, and we really need to prioritize and make sure it is the most effective way to get you from point A to B. And so I think fixing the funding formula really has to be a huge, huge priority, and it's a big problem right now when we have gone from almost $0 in debt to like $24.5 billion of maintenance debt. I think $3 to $6 billion of operating debt, and really, really gotten into what I would say is almost a debt spiral.
Mm-hmm. And you said you have something on your website about changing the governance structure.
Yeah.
Is that a solution to the funding, or what? How would that impact what our say?
So I'm a big government nerd, although I try to have fun with it, right? Which is like I think that for all the forms of government we have, the one that we don't have is a city and its commuting suburbs, right? And it really plays a huge impact on the T, which is like Boston is just too small to like manage all the tea by itself, right? Because a lot of the tea doesn't go into Boston.
Right.
And then the state is just too big. A lot of people in the state just don't take the tea, right? You need this middle form of government. And I would say like that's why I joke every April Fools, not this year, but in general about like, like mega Boston or mega Cambridge or mega Somerville, whatever, because like, we are missing this form of government. And that's fundamental to how Montreal fixed their REM, which is like they had a lot of similar problems we did a few decades ago, where Montreal is small and it was surrounded by smaller municipalities. But instead, they were like, we're going to do some municipal consolidation. And in my version, you don't even have to actually annex the municipalities. You could just have like a metro governance of the T, right? Like give board seats from all the local municipalities to the T board. But Montreal did this, and now their T is expanding. Their REM system is like brought down costs, and it really is just like incentive structures and about politics and like the boring things of like, actually, if you're a state rep from Western Mass, you probably don't care about the T and you're not particularly interested in expanding it. But if you're in Cambridge or Somerville or, Boston, it's like the heart of our district, and you can't imagine it not function.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine it because like for the next 10 days, we're not going to have a red line. But,
Yeah. It was very painful for me to get to Kendall today.
oh yeah. Yeah. Especially with the rain right now. But okay. Let's move to a slightly, I mean, it's another big item. More studies shown that middle and lower middle class people are leaving Massachusetts because they can't afford to live here. And I mean, my friends are moving out with kids and stuff like that, or, moving out to the suburbs or other states. And we talked in January, you're well known for pushing some big things in Cambridge, removing parking minimums, supporting the AHO and multifamily housing. Do you have your eye on any specific state policies that you'd support on Beacon Hill?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that let's talk about we'll leave utilities to the side, although they're also very expensive for a moment, and just focus on what I think are the biggest three, which is like the number one time when people leave our state is when they have kids. Right. And that is something to really focus in on. And I think that like universal pre-K, but also expanding it so it's lower, right? Like in Cambridge, we just had a conversation about making it so that 3-year-olds are eligible. And I think, eventually down the line, getting to universal childcare and then also universal after school. Because if you're working on 9 to 5, you need your kids to get out then, not earlier. I think are really, really important both for educational outcomes in some ways, but also just for like childcare sorts of things. And I think that's really important and hyper focusing on that specific population. And then I think that like transit is expensive in that it both takes forever to get anywhere or it's super expensive, right? Like if you can't get to the red line today and you don't want to take 2 hours to get from Alewife to Kendall Square, you'll probably take an Uber that will cost $50. And so that's your trade-offs, 2 hours of your time or $50. And I think that we really, really do need to prioritize that. But I've talked about that a lot. And then I would say the single biggest budget line on everyone's budget is housing. And so I think that that's a place where we need to do an incredible amount and do the right things, right? Like we are 50th out of 50 states in terms of permitting new housing. And I think that we keep on fighting the wrong fights. Like, I built Abundant Housing Massachusetts, and we were one of the proud defenders of the MBTA Communities Act, organizing in Milton, organizing in Wellesley and in Marblehead and Weston to make sure that they passed the MBTA Communities Act. And, I would say that I'm actually pretty critical of it. Like we were not a part of writing it. That was like a little bit before we existed. And if you look at the implementation, it's like, if you wanted to maximize conflict and minimize impact, I don't think you could have written a better bill, which is like it started all these fights in all these towns. And communities mostly complied with malicious compliance, right? Like Weston zoned over industrial land that's never going to be developed. Marblehead famously just zoned over a golf course.
What are we doing here? Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really, really not well thought out. And I would say like in comparison, I've been like really trying to push this starter homes ballot question that's made it to the ballot. And that I think will have a profound impact in that it will not get us to the 200,000 units, but it will probably build as many units as the MBTA Communities Act for like a tenth of the fight. And so it's not just about fighting for building more housing, but it's like realizing what specific policies can you pass that have the most, bang for the bang for the dollar, whatever the analogy would be. I think it's like juice for the squeeze is the other one. But like I think that there's a lot better ways we can do in that we're not anywhere close to meeting our goals, and I think we're actually the most disappointing state in the union by a lot of metrics.
And so specifically, would you look at, amending the Communities Act to make it just, instead of saying, well, you write your own code, this is what, instead saying this is, taking the state prerogative and changing the zoning in all the communities?
I think that the single most effective thing we could do is a strong transit-oriented development bill. That is to say that, like, yes, like you need to build housing in the state, and we're going to set some statewide standards, right? And I think that that will actually, I personally believe it will be politically more popular than the MBTA Communities Act for a reason I can get into if you're curious. But also, I think it would just, if the zoning details are right and we are ambitious, like it would make a tremendous dent in actually solving the housing issue. Like, how many commuter rail stops do you go to that are just parking lots, right? Even MBTA stops that are just near parking lots. Like, that is prime spots where you should be really tightly dense and have housing right near them. And I think it would make a profound impact.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I work in Lawrence, and on that line, on the Haverhill line, there's stops that are just, they're just tumbleweeds when you go through. It's crazy. Yeah, it's a missed opportunity. So as a member of the state Senate, you would have more impact on how Massachusetts deals with the federal government in the state borders. What policies will you push to address what's basically been a violent anti-immigration push that's being perpetrated by ICE in this state? Of course, Maura Healey's working with ICE, or we're the only state that still works with ICE. And we have a Burlington ICE facility that sounds pretty heinous, but what policies would you support?
Yeah, so I've already come out in support of ending the 287G agreement that we have with ICE. I think it's profoundly disappointing that we're still working with ICE even after they, it was long ago known that they could killed people in Minneapolis and around the country, and then more recently we saw the shootings, and Maura Healey still goes out and defends them and this agreement, and I think it's just like profoundly wrongheaded, and I think that we need to end our contracts with ICE, and I think that in general, like my philosophy is like, yeah, it's true that we can't stop the federal government, but what we can do is we can make each abduction take twice as long. And that sounds in some ways like boring. But on the other hand, I would say it's like half as many abductions by the time that Trump is out of office. And I think that's actually a profound impact. And I think that it is really deeply depressing how you hear stories all the time. Like there was one just last week of, a woman who came here to go to a Noah Kahan concert. And, she was a dreamer, had been here since she was a kid. And then just on the flight back was pulled over. And it's like, or to the fact that Rumeza Ozturk was taken at the beginning of his term right next door. And it's like, it happens all the time. Every week you hear one new horror story, and it just needs to stop. And I think that we need to be as aggressive as we can on this.
Okay. Let's change to a procedural question. From a progressive point of view, I think you have a lot of popular ideas, a lot of good ideas. How do you deal with a historically ineffective Senate who hasn't, they haven't moved significantly on some of the issues like improving the MBTA in years? What are your thoughts? Have you thought about trying to form a coalition with some of these new challengers that are running for office?
Well, I would say I like a lot of the new challengers that have been running, and I think we've all kind of naturally landed in very similar places. And obviously, I made an endorsement earlier in the state rep race as well. And so that's been something I've been supportive of. I would say let's break it down a little bit, and I think that'll help us make us more tangible, which is that in the state House, why is it so ineffective, right? And I think first we have to actually prove the premise, right? Which is we passed the least amount of legislation of any state. Most of that is in a big omnibus at the end of the term, which we are now in the middle of. So we will see how this turns out. And I think that it is a terrible way to govern in that I was trying to find out some of the amendments to some of the AI safety legislation that I was looking at, and I can't even find what happened to it. Instead, it's like an omnibus will happen, and you can't even follow the process. And it's like it's really, terrible on a measure of count. So like if we like break it down even further, it's like you don't know how your representatives voted in committee so often or in general. When they do vote, I think I counted, I cast about 2,000 public votes a year, and the state house casts about 100. And so it's profoundly few votes. And when they do cast votes, it's on an omnibus where it's really hard to tell, like, did they just like vote on the whole thing? What parts did they support? What part did they not support? And it becomes impossible to actually follow what's happening because it feels like for 2 years, like nothing is happening. At that end of the term, they just pass this one thing that is like a mess of all these pieces of legislation. And so, how do I think that we got here and what can we do about it? So I think, part of it is like 2 out of the last 3 speakers of the House were indicted for corruption, and we have a pretty strong House and Senate leadership, which is that like, we back in the day restricted pay for our elected officials in the Constitution. And it felt like, oh, this is a full-time job. We can't live off of our base salary. And so we're going to start giving out stipends, except instead of like other states or other places, instead of giving out like, oh, if you're a committee chair, you get an extra money. Instead, we just gave all the power to the Senate president and the Speaker of the House, such that you make $82,000 by base, and you can get up to $200,000 based on how much the Senate leadership likes you and the House leadership likes you, and it's at their full discretion, and it creates all these really bad incentives to just get along get along. And I think that there's a bunch of ways to fix it. I've been, supporting and gathering signatures for the public records ballot question, and I think the stipend reforms one didn't make it, but I think that that's something that you should either, as the court suggested, just pass it through the state house itself and just say like we're tying it to your positions, or honestly, I think that like it dismissed it on you can't make these adjustments. Well, I would just amend the Constitution to increase the base pay, but then say you're not allowed to take additional pay and just make the stipends illegal. And I feel like all of this stuff polls really, really popularly, but like the state house is kind of insular and kind of gets into this loop,
Yeah. Sorry, which state rep race did you endorse in? Was that in the?
I was on a day one endorser in the Evan McKay versus Marjorie Decker race.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you talked extensively about improving transparency and accountability on Beacon Hill, and God knows we agree with you. But in this area or in other positions where your stance is going to differ dramatically with the Senate president, how will you decide to push your priorities without getting buried on the back bench like other elected officials have claimed happened to them, including like Pat Jehlen and Will Brownsberger said during our forum that that happened to him in the House, and that's part of the reason he ran for Senate.
I'll appeal for a little bit to authority first and then get to it, which is I would say that whether like people have very strong feelings about me in Cambridge, but whether you love me or you're not the biggest fan of my work, I think no one will say that I've not been effective. And I think that, policymaking is an art form. And so I'll talk a little bit about it, but a little bit, it's hard to describe. And I will say that I feel like I'm pretty darn good at what I do. And I have a good understanding of like the levers of power and influence that you can have. So to go into the details, I think you should have an understanding of like what are things that you just won't be able to get through the system, and it's just going to be really hard, right? It's part of the reason why I supported the public records reform, and I think that we should have an open meeting law ballot question as well, which is just to say that like there are certain like things that you like are hard to get through the process of the state house, but are actually extremely, extremely popular among the voters. And so just take them to the voters directly. Like you'll get it done faster, easier, and you can support advocates and like build a coalition of people that you can go to every election that you can help make more and more of these reforms outside. And so I do think that some of these reforms, especially to internal procedures, will need to be made there because it's just like too hard on the inside because people don't have the right incentives to do so. And actually that is a place where even if you're elected, you do get influence over, right? Like the public records reform ballot question, if you look at the biggest supporters in terms of its donors, like Diana DiZiglio made a huge impact on that, right? And I think that she's an elected official that's been using her power, and I would love to be, hopefully number 2 on that or similar legislation in the future as we're doing ballot questions. Mm-hmm. In terms of like pushing specific policy forward and things. I think, fundamentally your power comes from the people. And, you answer that by saying like, oh, well, like I won't lose election because like this is what my voters believe. But you fundamentally also need to get people in other people's districts on board. And then it becomes harder to silo you. So what I would say is that like, it's not just me, like, on housing policy, for example, like we built abundant housing and we have organizations in dozens and dozens of communities. Every community that's had an MBTA communities vote, we have organized and helped support that. And so that means that there are, many, many, many communities, many, dozens of state senators and state reps where we have organize people in their districts. And so when you say like, I want this housing policy, you're not just saying that I support it. You're not just saying my constituents support it, but you're saying constituents all across the state support it. And then you bring in other factors and other people. And I think you can make a pretty profound impact in that way. And I think that that's a huge part of it. Hopefully that helps.
Do you have like a role model in the Senate or somebody you would look to in this current Senate or maybe any Senate or in the House that you'd say they're doing it right. They're trying to do the good work.
So I don't talk about this as much because, I'm like obviously in Massachusetts, most people care about Massachusetts, but, I mostly start the story with like, I passed a bunch of stuff in Cambridge and then we formed Abundant Housing Massachusetts and we passed a bunch of stuff in the State House, right? But I would go further and say that, when I was, first in the housing policy, it was very, very early before like, housing reform and all that sorts of stuff became hot. And so there was actually a bunch of us all across the country that found each other on the internet. And we started not just Abundant Housing Massachusetts, but Welcoming Neighbors Network, which is our national version of it. And so we've been a big part of the Road to Housing Act that's made it through Congress. Writing letters and like this should be involved and should not be involved and trying to bring constituencies from all across the country together. And I've been really impressed by the work that, our Senator Elizabeth Warren and Tim Scott in South Carolina, I believe, have done. And I would say that's a great example where like the Road to Housing Act made it almost unanimously through Congress in a time where nothing else does. And it was like actually incredible. Like there's actually very little in the bill that I don't like. I think that is one of the strongest pieces of housing legislations we've ever gotten through Congress. And I think that, Senator Warren did a great job of working very closely with the Republican and getting all this good stuff in it. And I think that was really, really incredible to see,
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we didn't touch on today or any kind of, closing statement that you'd like to make?
Yeah, happy to. I would say that like, I'm working, like I really believe in my message is, a big part of why I'm running, which is that like, I think Massachusetts is fundamentally a good place to live, right? I think we have so much that's going for us. And yet I think that there's specific shortcomings. And I think that they are very, very solvable. Like I am both like a progressive who believes in we need to raise more revenue and like fund universal pre-K and childcare and so on and so forth. And like I look at housing and transit and utility costs and I'm like, there's a million things that we could do to get out of our own ways on there. Like you don't end up with, next to New York City and San Francisco, the most expensive housing in the country, the most expensive utility costs after Hawaii and California, and the longest commutes in the country without doing not just one thing wrong, but a profound number of things wrong. And I don't believe it's the case where, we talked, and I talk a lot about how ineffective the State House is, but I don't think it's just like the State House wants there to be long commutes and wants housing to be expensive and wants utility costs to be expensive. I think that it's also like they're not engaged in the details and actually making things work. In that, like, we are a state that really cares about clean energy, right? And we pass an environmental piece of legislation every term or two. And I think it's one of those areas where I'm really proud of, right? Like, we passed the net zero stretch code and all that sorts of stuff. And yet 75% of the electricity energy we generate is from gas. And it took us 9 years to permit offshore wind, so long that Trump got to cancel it not once, but twice. Yeah. And I think that it's not just a problem of having good intentions or good values, but it's like actually our rules are written in such a poor way that we step on ourselves. And I think that I am not only like believe in progressive values, but I'm also like very detailed oriented that the laws have to make sense. And sometimes I like to think of myself as like the broccoli candidate, which is like I know that no one cares about like these subclauses and these commas and procurement, but it profoundly, profoundly matters and affects everything we do. And I think my particular value add is like, actually, I think all the candidates in this race have very similar values, but like I profoundly care about getting the details right so that we can actually build housing, such that we can build transit and get the T working and, have clean energy and all this sorts of stuff. And like, and I really, really think that it is both the revenue problem, but also like there's so much poorly written legislation that could just be fixed and it would solve so much of our problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Well, I think it's a good way to close. Thank you, Vice Mayor Azeem, for coming on and being our guest. Maybe next time you can come on and tell us what goes on in the state Senate.
Oh, I would love to. I'm sure we'll have a lot to gossip about.
Yeah. We'd love to hear it. Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Pete.